I didn't question it at first. That's the part I keep coming back to, late at night, when the house is quiet and my thoughts feel louder than they should. Back then, everything around me still felt familiar. Not perfect, but familiar enough that I didn't feel the need to look too closely. I was 81 years old at the time, living in my son's home after my health had begun to slow me down. It wasn't an easy decision for me. I had spent most of my life taking care of myself, managing my own routines, my own space, my own silences. But age has a way of rearranging what you think you can handle alone. When my son suggested I come live with them just for a while, I told myself it was practical, sensible, temporary. His wife was polite in those early days. Careful. She spoke softly to me, asked how I was feeling, reminded me when it was time to rest. I noticed those things and took them as kindness. I wanted to believe that was what they were. I told myself I was lucky to have family willing to make room for me. The house had its own rhythm, one I slowly learned. Mornings were quiet. Afternoons moved slowly. Evenings were louder, filled with conversations that didn't always include me, but I didn't mind. I had learned, long ago, how to sit with myself. Silence had never frightened me. If anything felt off back then, I blamed it on the adjustment. New place. New routines. A different pace. I reminded myself that change is harder when you're older, that confusion can creep in more easily than it used to. That thought alone kept me from asking questions I didn't yet know how to form. There were moments, small ones, that I noticed and then dismissed just as quickly. A look exchanged across the room. A conversation that stopped when I entered. A feeling that I had walked into something already decided. I told myself it wasn't about me. It rarely is, after all. I trusted my son. That trust had been built over a lifetime. I trusted that if something were wrong, he would say something. And because he said nothing, I learned to stay quiet too. Silence has a way of teaching you how to behave. I didn't feel unsafe then. I felt present, but slightly out of step. As though the world around me had moved an inch to the left and I was still standing where I always had. It wasn't frightening. Just uncomfortable enough to notice, not uncomfortable enough to resist. So I settled in. I folded myself into their household. I followed the patterns that were already there. I stopped questioning the little things because questioning takes energy, and at my age, you learn to save that energy for what truly matters. At least, that's what I told myself. Looking back now, I understand that this was the moment everything began, not with an event, not with a mistake, but with my decision to assume nothing was wrong simply because no one said it was. Some truths don't arrive loudly. They wait patiently, growing heavier with time. At the beginning, though, I only felt tired. And tired people don't question nearly enough. The first week or two passed the way most transitions do, quietly, with small discomforts that feel too ordinary to mention. I unpacked my things slowly, not because I had so much, but because I wanted to place each item with care. A framed photo of my late husband on the dresser. A little jar of buttons I'd kept since the children were small. My favorite cardigan folded in the top drawer, just the way I liked it. Those little rituals helped me feel like I still belonged to myself. My son insisted I take the room at the end of the hall. It was close enough that I didn't feel tucked away, but private enough that I could close the door when I needed to. His wife, my daughter-in-law, made a point of asking if I was comfortable. If the sheets felt soft enough. If I needed another blanket. She said it with a smile that looked practiced, but I told myself I was being unkind to even notice that. In the mornings, I would wake early out of habit. I'd sit on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting my joints remember how to move. Then I'd shuffle into the kitchen where the house smelled faintly of coffee and whatever cleaner she used on the counters. Sometimes she'd already be there, scrolling on her phone, the screen lighting her face in the pale morning. She'd glance up and say, "Good morning," in a pleasant voice, as if she were greeting a neighbor. It wasn't cold. Not exactly. But it wasn't warm either. I tried to make myself useful. I offered to fold laundry, to peel potatoes, to wipe down the table after dinner. She always refused at first. "Oh no, you sit," but after a while her refusals became shorter, sharper. Like she didn't want to argue with me, but she also didn't want me interfering with how she ran her home. I understood that. I really did. A home has its own rules, and the person keeping it together doesn't like those rules questioned, even by accident. So I adjusted. I did less. I stayed out of the way. Evenings were when I noticed the distance most. My son would come home tired, loosen his tie, kiss her cheek, and talk about his day. She would respond with quick little remarks, then turn the conversation toward things that needed fixing: bills, schedules, errands. I would sit at the end of the table, listening, nodding when it felt appropriate. Sometimes he would ask me how I was doing, and I'd say, "I'm fine," because it felt like the only answer that didn't create trouble. There was a gentleness in my son when he spoke to me, the kind of gentleness that made me want to protect him from more stress. That, more than anything, kept me quiet. I didn't want to be another problem he had to solve. And then there were the small moments. Little slips. Things that could be nothing, and because they could be nothing, I allowed them to be nothing. Once, I walked into the living room and she was talking to my son in a low voice. The moment she saw me, she stopped. Not in a startled way. More like someone closing a drawer. My son looked up, smiled, asked if I needed anything. I said no, because suddenly I didn't want anything except to leave the room and let them finish whatever I had interrupted. Another time, I heard my name from the kitchen, just my name, followed by a pause. I couldn't hear the rest, but I could hear the tone. That tone you use when you're careful not to sound cruel. I stood there for a moment, holding the edge of the hallway wall, and then I walked back to my room without announcing myself. I told myself it was better that way. I have always been someone who notices. Even when I pretend not to. But I didn't question it. Not then. Because questioning means admitting that something is wrong. And once you admit that, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to the comfortable story you were telling yourself. So I stayed inside that comfortable story a little longer. I told myself they were adjusting too. That maybe she was overwhelmed. That my presence, however quiet, changed the feel of their marriage, their home, their privacy. I blamed myself for being an inconvenience. It felt easier than blaming anyone else. And in those early days, there was still enough normalcy to make doubt feel inappropriate. Meals were eaten. Lights were turned off at night. The trash went out on schedule. Life continued in a way that suggested everything was fine. The trouble with fine is that it can hide a great deal. It can sit on top of things like a neat tablecloth, covering what you'd rather not look at. I didn't know yet what I was being invited not to see. I only knew that something in me had started paying closer attention, even as I insisted to myself that there was nothing to pay attention to. It wasn't one clear moment that unsettled me. It was a collection of smaller ones, scattered across days, easy to forget if you weren't already paying attention. And I wasn't sure yet that I should be paying attention. That uncertainty made everything feel heavier than it needed to be. I began misplacing things. At least, that's what it felt like at first. My reading glasses weren't where I'd left them. A sweater I wore often showed up folded differently than I remembered. Once, I opened my bedside drawer and felt a brief, strange pause in my chest, the way you do when something looks familiar but not quite right. I closed the drawer and told myself not to be dramatic. Age plays tricks on you, or so I had always believed. I had watched friends grow forgetful, watch them laugh it off at first, then quietly worry about it later. I promised myself I wouldn't be one of those people who panicked at every small slip. I took pride in being reasonable, so when I noticed gaps, little blank spaces where my memory should have been, I blamed myself before anything else. I told myself this was what slowing down felt like. I even mentioned it once, lightly, over dinner, saying something like, "I swear my mind isn't as sharp as it used to be." My daughter-in-law smiled and said, "That happens," in a voice that sounded reassuring enough. My son nodded, distracted, already thinking about something else. That should have been the end of it. A shared laugh. A harmless admission. But something about how quickly the moment passed stayed with me. It felt efficient. As though the explanation had been waiting, ready to be placed neatly over my concern. After that, I became more careful about what I said. I didn't want to sound like someone who complained. There's a fine line, especially at my age, between being honest and being dismissed. I had crossed that line before in other places, other times. I knew how easily concern could be relabeled as confusion. I started keeping small mental notes instead. Nothing formal. Just observations. A mental list I never intended to show anyone. The way my room looked when I left it compared to how it looked when I returned. The tone my daughter-in-law used when she reminded me of things I didn't remember forgetting. The way my son listened without really listening, his attention split between me and whatever was happening on his phone. There was an afternoon when I felt particularly unsettled. I had gone to my room to lie down, feeling more tired than usual. When I woke up, it took me a moment to remember where I was. That alone frightened me enough that I sat there, breathing slowly, waiting for the feeling to pass. Eventually it did. Still, when I walked into the hallway, I noticed my daughter-in-law watching me from the kitchen. Not with concern. With something closer to assessment. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I think so," I said, because that was true in the simplest sense. "Good," she replied, already turning away. That was all. No follow-up. No lingering care. I stood there longer than I needed to, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, feeling strangely exposed. I told myself I was reading too much into it. That people look at each other all the time without meaning anything by it. But that night, lying in bed, I realized something uncomfortable. I had begun measuring my words. Monitoring my movements. Adjusting myself so as not to appear forgetful, needy, or in the way. I was performing competence in my own son's house. That realization made my chest tighten. Not because I thought anyone meant me harm, but because I felt myself shrinking without having decided to. I had started doubting my own perceptions, and that doubt made it easier for everything else to stay just out of focus. Still, I didn't question it out loud. Not yet. I told myself this was temporary. That once I settled in fully, once everyone got used to each other, these feelings would pass. I wanted to believe that what I was sensing wasn't real enough to deserve a name. But once you start noticing how carefully you're being handled, it becomes hard to stop noticing. By then, I had learned the shape of my days well enough to notice when something didn't quite fit. Not enough to accuse, not enough to alarm myself, but enough to feel unsettled in a way I couldn't shake. The kind of unease that sits quietly in the background, waiting for moments of stillness to make itself known. I began to rely on routines more than I ever had before. I woke at the same time. I dressed in the same order. I placed my things in the same spots. It wasn't because I was afraid of forgetting, at least, that's not what I told myself. It was because routines gave me something solid to hold on to. If everything followed a pattern, then any break in that pattern would be easier to notice. Still, there were breaks. Sometimes it was a simple thing, like finding my nightstand slightly rearranged. My book turned face down when I was certain I'd left it open. A glass moved from one side to the other. Once, I found my cardigan hanging in the closet when I was sure I'd folded it over the chair. Each time, I paused. Each time, I told myself I must have done it and simply forgotten. I didn't say anything. I was careful not to. There's a particular fear that comes with being thought unreliable. Once that idea settles into someone else's mind, it becomes very hard to remove. I had seen it happen to others, how quickly concern turned into decisions being made on their behalf. I wasn't ready for that. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, seemed increasingly comfortable reminding me of things. "You already did that," she'd say, or, "We talked about this yesterday." Her voice was never sharp. Never unkind. That, in a way, made it harder. If she had been rude, I could have pushed back. But politeness leaves little room for protest. My son continued to float between us, present but not fully engaged. If I ever hesitated before answering a question, he would gently fill in the space for me. "She probably forgot," he'd say, smiling, as if to make it easier for me. I smiled back, because correcting him felt more awkward than accepting the explanation. There was a morning when I stood in the kitchen holding my teacup, trying to remember if I had already poured sugar into it. I stared at the surface of the tea, searching for clues. My daughter-in-law watched me for a moment, then said lightly, "Careful, you don't want to add too much." I laughed, embarrassed, and poured nothing at all. That laugh stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because it was cruel, but because it felt rehearsed on my part. A way to smooth over a moment that didn't need smoothing if I had felt secure. I began to notice how often my uncertainty was answered for me. How quickly explanations arrived. How little room there was for me to decide what I thought had happened. It wasn't aggressive. It was efficient. Like a story being edited before it could fully form. At night, I replayed these moments in my mind, trying to decide if I was imagining things. I told myself that people who are truly in danger don't wonder this much. They know. They feel it clearly. What I felt was vague. Slippery. Easy to dismiss. And yet, there was a growing awareness that something had shifted. I was no longer simply living in their home. I was being observed within it. Measured. Interpreted. The most unsettling part was how normal everything still looked from the outside. Meals were shared. Conversations continued. No voices were raised. No obvious lines were crossed. If I had tried to explain my discomfort to someone else, I wouldn't have known where to begin. So I stayed quiet. I told myself that silence was patience, that patience was wisdom. That time would eventually clarify what my instincts could not. I didn't realize then that time doesn't always clarify things. Sometimes it just gives them more room to settle in. By the time I reached the point where I could no longer ignore the pattern, I had already spent weeks convincing myself that there was nothing to see. That effort, constant, quiet, exhausting, had begun to wear me down. I noticed it in my body before I noticed it in my thoughts. I felt heavier in the mornings. Slower to rise. As if my limbs needed permission to move. I started sleeping more during the day, telling myself it was normal. At my age, tiredness becomes an acceptable explanation for almost anything. If I felt foggy, it was age. If I felt unsteady, it was age. If I couldn't quite remember the order of things, it was age. That word covered so much that it began to feel dangerous in its convenience. The house continued to run smoothly around me. Too smoothly. My daughter-in-law seemed to anticipate my needs before I spoke them. If I hesitated near the stairs, she appeared beside me. If I paused too long in the kitchen, she suggested I sit. Always gentle. Always reasonable. There was nothing I could point to and say, "This is wrong." But something in me had begun to resist being guided so carefully. I started paying closer attention to the timing of things. When conversations happened. When doors were closed. When my son was present, and when he wasn't. I noticed that my daughter-in-law's tone changed slightly depending on who else was in the room. With him, she sounded reassuring. With me alone, she sounded efficient. Like someone managing a task. One afternoon, I mentioned feeling off. Not unwell exactly, just not myself. I chose my words carefully, afraid of sounding dramatic. She listened, nodded, and said, "That happens sometimes." The phrase was familiar by then. It ended the conversation neatly, like a period at the end of a sentence. Later that evening, my son asked if I was doing okay. I told him yes. The truth was more complicated than that, and I didn't know how to say it without sounding unsure of myself. He seemed relieved by my answer. That relief stayed with me, heavier than concern would have been. I began to feel as though my experiences were being filtered before they reached anyone else. As though my reality had to pass through a quiet approval process before it could exist openly. That realization made me feel small in a way I hadn't felt in years. And still, I blamed myself. I wondered if I was being overly sensitive. If living in someone else's home had made me too aware of my place. I wondered if this was simply what it felt like to age in front of other people, your independence shrinking while they pretended not to notice. But then there were moments that refused to fit into that explanation. Moments when things I was certain of were gently dismissed. When my confidence was treated like a misunderstanding. When the same reassurance appeared again and again, identical each time, no matter the circumstance. "It's nothing," she would say. Or, "You must have forgotten." Or sometimes, it was just one of those things. Different words, same meaning. Same effect. I didn't argue. I nodded. I let the explanation settle over me like a blanket. But beneath that blanket, something was stirring. A quiet awareness that this wasn't about any single incident. It was about how easily my certainty was being replaced. I hadn't yet reached the point where I could name what was happening. But I had begun to understand that whatever it was, it thrived on my willingness to doubt myself. And that doubt, once planted, had started to grow. I went to bed that night knowing one thing for certain: if I didn't begin trusting my own sense of things again, I might lose it altogether. Once the idea took hold that I needed to trust myself again, I became aware of how difficult that actually was. Doubt has a way of softening your edges. It makes you hesitant, careful in ways that feel like politeness on the surface but are really self-erasure underneath. I had been practicing that kind of politeness for weeks without realizing it. I started testing small things. Not to trap anyone, not to prove anything, just to see if my memory still belonged to me. I placed objects deliberately. My keys on the left side of the dresser instead of the right. A folded note inside a book I hadn't finished reading. Nothing important. Nothing that would matter if I were wrong. The next day, the keys were back where they always used to be. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at them, my heart beating faster than the moment deserved. I told myself I must have moved them absent-mindedly. That explanation came easily now, almost automatically. It had been practiced enough times to feel natural. But then it happened again. A small thing. A quiet thing. A choice I remembered making that seemed to have been gently undone. Each time, there was an explanation ready, hovering just close enough that I didn't have to ask for it. "It happens," my daughter-in-law would say, in that same calm voice. "You know how these things go." I began to notice how often that voice appeared right after my uncertainty did. How smoothly it filled the space before I could decide what I thought had occurred. It wasn't forceful. It didn't need to be. It worked because it aligned so neatly with the story I was already telling myself. My son remained kind, but distant in a way that felt deliberate. When I brought up small concerns, framed carefully as questions, he would listen with half his attention and then glance at his wife, as if waiting for her to respond. She always did. And once she spoke, the matter seemed settled. That dynamic wore on me more than I expected. Not because I needed to be believed, but because I needed to be heard before conclusions were drawn. Instead, I felt myself being gently guided away from my own perceptions, step by step. There was an evening when I almost said something I couldn't take back. We were sitting together after dinner, the television murmuring in the background. I had noticed something earlier that day, another small inconsistency, another moment that didn't line up. The words sat at the back of my throat, heavy, ready. But then my son laughed at something on the screen. His wife leaned against him. The room felt settled, complete without my contribution. I swallowed the words and told myself it wasn't the right time. There always seemed to be a reason to wait. That night, lying in bed, I felt a growing tension I couldn't ignore. Not fear. Not anger. Something quieter. A sense that I was slowly being trained to doubt myself, and that the training was working. That frightened me more than any single incident could have. Patterns don't announce themselves all at once. They reveal themselves gradually, through repetition. Through the same response delivered in slightly different packaging. Through silence that appears reliable until you realize how often it replaces conversation. I had reached the point where I no longer believed everything I was told, but I also no longer trusted myself enough to challenge it. That space in between is a lonely one. It's where certainty begins to erode, and where isolation can settle in unnoticed. I didn't yet have proof. I didn't even have a clear accusation. What I had was a growing awareness that something fundamental had shifted. That my role in the household was no longer just that of a guest or a mother, but something quieter and more fragile. And once that awareness takes root, it doesn't leave you alone. The decision to seek clarity did not come with urgency. It arrived slowly, the way difficult decisions often do, after the mind has exhausted every other explanation. I did not wake up one morning determined to uncover anything. I simply reached a point where continuing as I was felt heavier than the risk of knowing more. I chose something small to focus on. Not a confrontation. Not a question. Just information. Facts have a way of standing still, even when people do not. I told myself that if I could anchor myself to something concrete, the rest might become clearer. It started with a routine appointment, one I had kept for years, long before I moved into my son's home. The visit itself was uneventful, but there was a brief pause during the conversation that caught my attention. A hesitation that did not belong to me. The nurse glanced at the screen, then back at me, her expression careful in a way I had learned to recognize. She asked if everything had been going smoothly at home. The question was polite. Routine, even? But something about the way she asked it lingered. I answered the way I always did. Yes. It felt automatic. Practiced? She nodded and moved on, but the moment stayed with me. Later, I requested a copy of my records. I told myself it was for my own peace of mind. To keep track. To stay organized. No one questioned the request. No one needed to. It was, after all, my information. I reviewed the papers slowly, carefully, giving myself time to understand what I was seeing. Dates. Notes. Small details I might have overlooked before. I did not feel alarmed at first. Mostly, I felt tired. Sorting through years of information has a way of reminding you how much time has passed. Then I noticed something that did not align with my memory. It was minor enough that I nearly dismissed it. A discrepancy that could be explained in a dozen harmless ways. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. I turned the page. Then another. And another. There it was again. I closed the folder and sat quietly for a long moment, listening to the distant sounds of the house around me. Nothing had changed outwardly. The walls stood where they always had. The clock ticked. Life continued, unaware of what had just shifted inside me. I did not feel angry. I did not feel afraid. What I felt was a strange, hollow confirmation. Not proof, exactly, but enough to tell me that my doubts had not come from nowhere. I went back over the records a second time, slower now. With intention. The pattern was subtle, but it was there. Enough to make it impossible to return to the comfort of uncertainty. Still, I told no one. Not my son. Not his wife. Not yet. There is a particular loneliness that comes with knowing something you are not ready to say aloud. It settles into you quietly. You continue with your day, your routines, your conversations, all while carrying a weight that no one else can see. That evening, my daughter-in-law asked how my appointment went. Her voice was warm, attentive. I told her it was fine. She smiled, relieved, and changed the subject. I watched her carefully then, noticing things I had not allowed myself to notice before. The ease with which the moment passed. The confidence of someone certain the story would not change. I realized then that whatever was happening had relied on my silence as much as anything else. On my willingness to accept explanations without looking too closely. The records in my hands had not shouted the truth. They had whispered it. And once you hear that whisper, you cannot pretend you didn't. I went to bed that night knowing I had crossed a line, not outwardly, but inwardly. I had moved from doubt into awareness. And awareness, once gained, brings with it a responsibility you cannot easily escape. The days that followed felt different, though nothing on the surface had changed. That was the most unsettling part. The same conversations happened. The same meals were shared. The same polite questions were asked and answered. Yet underneath it all, I was carrying a new awareness that quietly altered how everything felt. I kept the records tucked away, not hidden exactly, but not visible either. I didn't want to act differently. I didn't want to give anything away. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed time. Time to understand what I had seen. Time to decide what it meant, and what it did not. I went back through my days in my mind, replaying moments that had once seemed insignificant. Conversations where my uncertainty had been gently corrected. Situations where decisions had been made for me before I realized a decision was even needed. Each memory took on a slightly different shape now, as though the light had shifted and revealed edges I hadn't noticed before. I paid closer attention to timing. To who was present when certain things happened, and who wasn't. I noticed how often my son was absent during moments that left me feeling unsettled. Not intentionally, perhaps. But consistently. His absence had created space that had been filled with explanations I hadn't questioned soon enough. My daughter-in-law remained calm. Pleasant. If anything, she seemed more attentive than before. She asked how I was feeling. She reminded me to rest. She reassured me when I hesitated. Each gesture looked like care, but I had begun to understand how easily care can resemble control when it isn't shared. I tested my memory again, quietly. Not with objects this time, but with conversations. I repeated something I knew I had already said, just to see how it would be received. She smiled and said, "Yes, you mentioned that earlier." There was no irritation in her voice. No surprise. Just confirmation. And yet, it struck me how quickly my words were categorized, filed away, reduced to something already handled. My son, when present, remained affectionate. He asked after my health. He made sure I was comfortable. But I noticed now how often he deferred. How easily he allowed answers to come from someone else. I wondered when that habit had formed, and why I hadn't noticed it sooner. One evening, as I sat alone in my room, I realized something that left me very still. Nothing I had discovered required confrontation. There was no dramatic moment waiting just around the corner. What I had found was quieter than that. It was a shift in power so gradual that it had almost gone unnoticed. Almost. The records had not accused anyone. They had simply existed, unchanged, waiting for someone to look closely enough. And when I did, they showed me that my confusion had been useful, not to me, but to others. That realization did not make me angry. It made me sad. Sad for how easily I had stepped aside. Sad for how much trust I had placed in the assumption that kindness and honesty always arrive together. I slept poorly that night. Not because I was afraid of what might happen next, but because I understood that something had already happened. Something that could not be undone by pretending any longer. By morning, I knew that staying silent forever was no longer an option. I didn't yet know what I would say, or to whom. I only knew that whatever came next would change the way this family spoke to one another. And change, once introduced, has a way of exposing things people would rather keep comfortably unexamined. I waited longer than I probably should have before saying anything. Not because I was unsure anymore, but because I wanted to understand how words might land in a house that had grown accustomed to silence. There is a difference between knowing something and choosing the moment to acknowledge it aloud. I needed the latter to feel deliberate, not reactive. The opportunity came on an ordinary evening. Dinner had ended. The dishes were drying in the rack. My son was in the living room, half watching the television, half answering messages on his phone. His wife moved about the kitchen with practiced ease, wiping counters, closing cabinets. The routine felt safe enough to step into. I said her name first. Calmly. No edge to it. She turned, smiling, the way people do when they expect a simple request. I told her I had been reviewing some of my records. I chose that word carefully, reviewing. Neutral. Responsible. Not accusatory. She nodded, still relaxed. That's good, she said. It's important to stay organized, I agreed. Then I mentioned a detail. Just one. A small inconsistency I had noticed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand an explanation. I simply stated what I had seen and said that I didn't understand it. The room shifted. Not dramatically. Subtly. Her smile didn't disappear, but it tightened, as though it had been adjusted slightly out of place. She glanced toward my son, then back at me. That's probably nothing, she said, lightly. Those things can be confusing. There it was. The familiar shape of the response. Polite. Reassuring. Closing the door before it had fully opened. I felt something settle in my chest, not anger, but clarity. I told her I had looked more than once. That I wanted to be sure before bringing it up. I said it the way I had learned to say difficult things over a lifetime of marriage and motherhood, calmly, without accusation, leaving room for conversation. She sighed then. Not with irritation, but with something closer to weariness. You worry too much, she said. And you've been tired lately. That can affect how things seem. My son looked up from his phone at that point. What's going on? He asked, his voice gentle, already leaning toward resolution. She answered before I could. Your mom's just a little confused about something in her paperwork, she said, smiling at him as if to reassure him more than me. I told her it's nothing to worry about. The words landed quietly, but their weight was undeniable. I watched my son nod, relieved. Watched him accept the explanation because it was easier than examining it. I spoke then, carefully. I said I wasn't confused. I said I had checked. I said I wasn't asking for reassurance, I was asking for understanding. The room grew still. My daughter-in-law's expression changed, just slightly. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she leaned into concern. "I just don't want you stressing yourself," she said. "At your age, stress can make things feel bigger than they are." It was a gentle sentence, thoughtful on the surface. And yet, it shifted the focus away from what I had seen and back onto what I was supposedly feeling. The conversation had been redirected without ever addressing the detail I had mentioned. I realized then that this wasn't going to unfold the way I once imagined confrontations did. There would be no raised voices. No dramatic admissions. What I was facing was something quieter, a refusal to meet me where I stood. My son suggested we talk about it another time. His voice was kind. Avoidant. Final enough to close the moment. I agreed, because pushing further would have required more energy than I was ready to spend. But as I returned to my room that night, I understood something with unsettling clarity. The truth had been spoken aloud, and it had been gently set aside. After that conversation, the house felt smaller. Not in size, but in possibility. The walls seemed closer, the air a little heavier, as though words left unspoken had begun to take up physical space. Nothing had been resolved, and yet something had clearly shifted. I could feel it in the way my daughter-in-law watched me now, more carefully, but also more guarded. She didn't avoid me. In fact, she did the opposite. She checked in more often. Asked if I needed anything. Reminded me gently of schedules, of appointments, of small tasks I hadn't asked to be reminded of. Each gesture arrived wrapped in concern, but it carried an undertone I couldn't ignore. I was no longer just being cared for. I was being managed. My son remained kind, though increasingly uncomfortable. He spoke to me softly, as if trying to keep everything calm by lowering his voice. When I mentioned feeling unsettled, he squeezed my hand and said he just wanted everyone to get along. I understood that instinct. I had lived with it myself for many years. Peace, even when fragile, can feel easier than truth. But peace built on avoidance has a cost. I noticed how decisions were now made without me. Small ones at first: what time we would eat, when errands would be run, who would be home and when. Then slightly larger ones, mentioned casually, already decided by the time they reached me. "We thought this would be better for you," she would say. And my son would nod, trusting her judgment more than questioning the process. I didn't argue. Not because I agreed, but because I recognized the pattern. Every objection I raised risked being framed as confusion. Every hesitation could be used to justify more control. The more I resisted, the more I might prove the story they seemed comfortable telling. So I chose restraint. I observed. I listened. I kept my records close, not to use as a weapon, but as an anchor. They reminded me that my awareness was real, even if it wasn't acknowledged. There were moments when I considered leaving. Packing my things quietly, calling a friend, finding another place to stay. But leaving would have meant admitting that the trust I had placed here was irrevocably broken. I wasn't ready for that truth yet. I needed to understand it fully before I acted on it. One evening, my daughter-in-law mentioned making some changes around the house for safety. She spoke as if it were already decided. As if my approval were unnecessary. I listened, nodding slowly, feeling a familiar tightening in my chest. Safety, I realized, had become the language through which my autonomy was being reduced. Who could argue with safety? Who would dare push back against something framed as care? That night, lying awake, I understood that the confrontation I had imagined was never coming. There would be no moment where everything was laid out plainly and resolved. Instead, there would be this, an ongoing negotiation where my voice mattered less each time it was softened by concern. I felt grief then. Not sharp, not sudden, but deep. Grief for the trust I had assumed would always exist between me and my son. Grief for the simplicity I had lost when I stopped questioning and started noticing. By the time sleep finally came, I knew that whatever happened next would not be dramatic. It would be quiet. And that quiet would change everything. By then, I had stopped hoping for understanding. That was the moment I didn't expect, but perhaps should have. Hope, I learned, is often the last thing to leave, quietly, without ceremony. Once it was gone, what remained was a clearer view of where I stood. I moved through the house more carefully now. Not because I felt unsafe in a physical sense, but because I understood how easily my actions could be interpreted on my behalf. Every pause, every hesitation, every moment of silence could be shaped into a story I hadn't chosen. So I kept my movements deliberate. Measured. I spoke less, but when I did, I chose my words with precision. My daughter-in-law continued to present herself as attentive. To anyone watching from the outside, she would have seemed patient, even devoted. She asked after my sleep. She reminded me to drink enough water. She framed every suggestion as concern. And yet, there was a distance now, an emotional narrowing that left little room for disagreement. My son noticed the change in me, I think. He asked once if something was wrong. I told him I was tired. That answer satisfied him, and I let it. There are some truths you stop offering when you realize they won't be received. What surprised me most was how quickly the household adjusted to this new balance. Decisions continued to be made smoothly. Routines held. No one seemed uncomfortable except me. That, more than anything, revealed how complete the shift had been. I was no longer part of the center of things. I was being accommodated at the edges. I began sorting through my belongings, slowly, without announcing it. Not packing exactly, just organizing. Separating what mattered from what didn't. It felt like preparing for something I hadn't yet named. Each item I set aside carried a small weight of memory, and with it, a quiet acknowledgement that my place here was temporary in ways I hadn't anticipated. There were moments when I caught my reflection and barely recognized the stillness in my face. I had always thought of myself as resilient, adaptable. And I was. But resilience, I realized, can also look like endurance. Like learning how to survive in spaces that no longer offer you full recognition. One afternoon, as I sat by the window, I understood that the greatest loss wasn't control or independence, though those mattered. It was trust. Trust that conversations would be honest. Trust that my experiences would be taken at face value. Trust that age had not quietly disqualified me from my own reality. That trust was gone now, not with a crash, but with a slow, steady erosion. And once eroded, it could not be restored by kindness alone. I didn't feel anger toward my son. I felt a sadness that settled deep, the kind that doesn't demand expression. I wondered how easily love can coexist with avoidance, and how often families choose comfort over clarity. As the days passed, I accepted something I had resisted for too long. Nothing more was going to be said. Nothing more was going to be explained. The story had already been decided in subtle ways that did not require my agreement. All that remained was what I would carry forward from this. Not revenge. Not confrontation. Just the quiet knowledge of what had changed, and what could not be repaired. Some endings do not announce themselves. They simply arrive, fully formed, and wait for you to notice. I left without an argument. That part surprises people when I tell them, though I rarely do. They expect a moment, a confrontation, a final conversation, some clear line drawn in the sand. But life doesn't always offer those shapes. Sometimes it simply nudges you forward until staying becomes heavier than going. I told my son I needed a change of scenery. A little time somewhere quieter. He looked relieved more than concerned, and that told me everything I needed to know. He hugged me, promised to call often, said we'd talk soon. We both knew what soon usually means. His wife helped me pack, efficient as ever, Careful not to rush me, careful not to linger either. She wished me well. I thanked her. The words were polite. Complete. Empty enough to close the door behind them. The place I went to was smaller. Simpler. It didn't matter much where it was. What mattered was the stillness. No one watching me too closely. No one correcting my memory before I finished a sentence. No one explaining my experiences for me. In that quiet, I felt something return, not all at once, but steadily. A sense of myself that had been dimmed, not lost. I thought often about what had happened, turning it over gently, without anger. I tried to understand it not as a single act, but as a series of small choices made easier by my silence and their certainty. I saw how concern can slip into control when it goes unquestioned. How kindness can exist alongside dismissal. How love does not always protect you from being minimized. My relationship with my son changed. Not dramatically. He still called. Still spoke with affection. But there was a distance now, one neither of us named. Some conversations stayed on the surface, where they felt safer. I accepted that. Pushing deeper would have required a kind of honesty neither of us seemed ready to practice. I don't regret speaking up when I did, even though it changed nothing outwardly. It changed something in me. It reminded me that noticing is not the same as accusing, and that trusting yourself does not always lead to validation, but it does lead to clarity. There are things you don't get back once they're gone. Not trust. Not the ease of belonging. Not the assumption that your voice will always be welcomed simply because you have earned it through years of love and sacrifice. Those things, once cracked, never quite fit the same way again. I live with that knowledge now. Quietly. Without bitterness. I've learned that dignity doesn't always look like winning. Sometimes it looks like leaving without needing to explain yourself one last time. Time did make the truth harder to ignore. But it also taught me something else, that seeing clearly, even late, is better than living comfortably inside a story that was never entirely mine. Some things never return to what they were. And once you accept that, you stop waiting for them to.